Hey shooters, this is John with Sun and Shadow, and today we are going to talk about holding versus dialing on your magnified optic. Hey, real quick, can you do me a favor and click all them buttons down there for me? That'd be awesome. Now the context for today's discussion is based on the tactical games. However, you can use this knowledge in 2-gun, 3-gun, quantified performance gas gun matches, PRS hunting, anywhere that you would need to make the decision between hold versus dial for your target. Holding refers to using a different hash mark on your reticle as the aim point for your shot on the target. This means that the target is not at your zero distance, it's either closer or further away, and you need to hold above or below the target in order to get an impact. So we would use a different portion of the reticle for a hold. Dialing means we're actually going to turn the adjustment knobs on the turrets of our optic in order to keep that center reticle on the target for the shot. Before we start working with holds versus dialing, there's a couple things that we need to understand beforehand. I'm not going to go into detail on all of these items, but what we really need are a zeroed reticle, meaning the center reticle lines up with your impact at a desired distance. Usually that could be 50 or 100 yards. The next thing that we need is a zeroed turret. So having a zeroed gun means you've got a zeroed reticle, but you also need to zero out the turrets. And what we'll do is we'll make sure that after we're done with the zero process, all these dials are reset back to zero. The next thing that we'll want, especially when we get out to farther ranges, is a ballistic profile. That can be done in your ballistic solver. This is where you're typing in your environmentals, your muzzle velocity, and you're getting a firing solution at all distances. And then lastly, we need to be able to understand the reticle that we have. So everybody's optic might be a little bit different as far as what the reticle looks like, what those measurements are. You need to understand your particular reticle so that you know what the measurements are inside of it. Then we also need to understand adjustments on the reticle. For instance, my reticles are almost always a mil reticle. I don't work in MOA anymore. So I started working in mil, you might work in MOA, you might have a BDC reticle. When I first started shooting long range, I had MOA adjustments on the turrets, but I had a mil reticle. So that was kind of some weird math to do as well. You just need to understand your reticle, what its adjustments are, and you also need to understand the adjustments on the turrets. So first let's talk about holds. Holdovers are typically used in a multi-target environment or when you need to react so quickly that there's no time to dial. So here we've got drawn out, I have 3 different targets at 3 different ranges. I'm not going to take the time to dial for each one of these targets unless I have the opportunity to do so. In this scenario here, we would hold for each one of these targets, which means that we're not going to have the center of the reticle on the target. Instead, we're going to hold a little bit higher in order to get these impacts. Now, a hold relies on using a different portion of the reticle as your aim point. This is why it's so important to understand your reticle and what all the measurements mean. When you go to zero your gun, you know that your reticle is only zeroed at one distance. And you might have a convergence distance somewhere else. Like if you're using a 50-yard zero, you might have another impact somewhere around 200 yards. If you zero at 100 yards, for the most part, you're never going to reconverge. So you've only got that one point where your bullet will impact exactly where the reticle shows. So since we only have one convergence point on our optic, you're going to have to hold over or under for every single other distance that you're firing at. So since we know what the reticle measurements are, in this scenario that I've constructed here, what we're going to do is we are going to hold over the target so that we've got a 1.8 mil hold on this 330 yard target, a 2.9 mil hold on this 417 yard target, and a 5.6 mil hold on this 602 yard target. And what that means is I'm going to find the 1.8 mil mark on my reticle, and I'm going to use that as my center aim point on the target. The same thing here on 417 yards. What I'm going to do is I'm going to probably use about a 3 mil hold, and I'm going to put that 3 right on the center of the target in order to take my shot. And then of course on the 600-yard target, same thing. We're probably going to look for about 5.5 mil. The marking on our reticle, I'm going to use that 5.5 mil mark on the center of this target. So some interesting things that you might note. On an LPVO, the turrets are usually capped, which means that there's a cap over the top of the adjustment for you to be able to dial. It means that most LPVOs are going to be meant to hold because they're usually put onto gas guns where you need to be able to shoot a little bit faster. And also a lot of these modern LPVOs are going to have trees in them. The reticle kind of looks like a tree. And that means that we're really trying to use the LPVO for holds for the most part. That doesn't apply to everything. It's just the LPVOs are kind of more intended to be optics that you would use holdovers with. So next, let's talk about dialing. Dialing is using the turrets to adjust the center aim point so that you can use the center part of the reticle to take your shot even at a distance that is not your zero distance. And what we're doing when we adjust these turrets is we're actually moving the reticle up and down or left to right on the optic so that you can use that center portion of the reticle as your aim point. And the reason that we might want to do that is because the center reticle is usually a little bit more precise for you to be able to take a more precise shot. And also, if you look through your reticle while you're doing a holdover, for instance, it's not quite as easy to get as fine a detail out of those little hash marks as it is if you just dialed straight. So let's say your hash marks are in 1/2 mil increments. Well, it's a little bit more difficult to say I need to hold 4.3 mil than it is to say, oh, I want to hold in between the 4 and the 4.5 mil. So you can get a little bit finer detail out of dialing, but it is a little bit slower process. For dialing, especially in the tactical games, I would really only use it when you have one target distance that you're engaging at. So in the tactical games, we commonly shoot paper at one set distance. So what I would do is I would dial, before we even start the stage, I would dial for that one specific distance. And that way, every time I take a shot, I can always use the center reticle, and I don't have to worry about holding up or down in order to get that impact for every single shot. The reason why that's important is because when you're stressed out, you're working really hard, you're trying to get those shots off, you don't want to have to remember that you have to hold over in one particular area every single shot. The eye is naturally drawn to that center of the reticle, so we would really want to do our best to dial for those single distance targets so that we can always make sure that we're using the center of the reticle in order to break our shot. There's no real extra thinking that has to be done. So in this scenario here, for dialing, we've got 3 different targets. We've got one at 240, one at 516, and one at 673 yards. And if we're going to dial for each one of those targets, what we would do is we would dial 0.9 on our turret in order to use the center reticle on the close target. And then we would dial up again to 4.3 mil in order to get a shot on this 516 yard target. And then finally for 673, we would continue turning the dial up until we get to 7 mils for a shot on this further target. Alright, we've gone over holds, we've gone over dialing. Now let's talk about using both in conjunction with each other. This is the way that I would typically shoot a precision gas gun stage, is by using both a hold and a dial, because there are multiple targets at multiple distances usually. So what I would commonly do is I would dial for the closest target or the target that requires the most precision, and I would hold over or under for all of the remaining targets. So in this example that I've got here, we have a target at 297, 460, and 701 yards. Now on our ballistic solver, we would see that I have a 100-yard zero and I'm using mils. I would hold at 1.4 mil for the close target, 3.4 mil for the middle target, and 7.6 mil for this far target. But what I want to do is I want to cut down the number of holds that I have to remember. So what I would do is I would dial up to 1.4 mil so that now I can use the very center reticle for this close target. and then I only have to remember 2 holds for the other 2 targets. That would be 2 mils for this center target and 6.2 mils for this target at 701 yards. So what we're doing is we're dialing for the close target so that we can use the center reticle at 0, and then we just do a little bit of math and we can end up having our adjusted holdovers for the other 2 targets. So this would be a little bit of a hybrid. So why would we want to use a combination of holdovers and dialing? The reason that we would use that combination is kind of twofold. First of all, you don't have to remember as many holds. You just know that your first target is the center reticle, and then you can remember at least one less hold for the rest of the targets. The second is that as you move the reticle up, what you're doing is you're giving yourself, your eyeball, more field of view so that you can see trace or see splash. If you're having to hold at a far target on the very bottom of your reticle, you can't see as much anymore around the target, which means that as you recoil, as the gun recoils after your shot, you're going to have to be looking for trace if you can see it, or you're going to have to be looking for splash. And since that target is all the way at the bottom of the picture, it's not as easy to see all those things. So by taking out the first target, by dialing out the first target, what you're doing is you're giving yourself more field of view so that you can see those impacts or splash. Now all that discussion was for further shots. You can actually use holds or dialing for closer shots as well. And when I say close shots, I mean 7, 8, 10 yards. And we can start to do some pretty interesting stuff with that.
So next we're going to look at holds close up. This is something called height over bore. You can look that up. That's the distance between the center line of the optic and the center line of the barrel. And you can see that there is kind of a little bit of a distance there that can really mess you up when you're close to these targets. We've got a target here at about 7 yards. And what we're going to end up having to do is hold high on the target in order to get a shot where we want it to be. So for example, if we're shooting at the eye box of this IPSC target, we're going to want to hold a little bit above the head in order to get a shot dropped into the eye box. So you can see here on the Triggercam that I'm going to aim a little bit above the head in order to get a hit right in the eye box. You can see we're aiming a little bit above the head in order to get those shots to drop into the eye box. That's a great example of holding when you're close up. So I've got a couple of pacers here set up on this target right in front of me. We are at 8 yards. We could be precise at 8 yards as well without having to just guess at the holdover. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go into my ballistic solver. Now I'm going to set this to 8 yards. And we can see here at the bottom left, I have to come up 7.3 mil. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to dial 7.3 mil. Let's see if we can get a hit. Square right in the center of that little pacer.
Now, one thing we didn't really talk about is wind. All of this discussion was kind of centered around elevation. When you start learning more about wind and how to hold for wind, what we're going to see a lot is that most shooters are going to dial for elevation, but they're going to hold for the wind. And the reason for that is the wind is constantly moving, is constantly changing direction, constantly changing speed. And if you dial for wind, it's possible to do that if you have a prevailing wind, let's say, at the range. But for the most part, most shooters are going to hold for wind just because it's so varied. It's not as constant as an elevation hold is. That's a general overview of holding versus dialing, or using both for the tactical games and other precision rifle matches. If you have any questions, please put them in the comments, message me directly. If you could, hit all them buttons, like and subscribe please, and we will see you on the next episode.